wrestling match is usually judged in two ways, the hype before it and then what happens in the ring. If we're talking about WWE, said match then vanishes into the abyss because so much more content is hurled at your face you're not allowed to enjoy what you've just seen. It's time to progress and move on to something else, and if you get left behind, more fool you just got eaten up by the wrestling dustbin. However, there is an exception to every rule, and that indeed runs true here, for you see, sometimes events that occur after a scrap give it a whole new meaning, almost giving you the opportunity to see it through new eyes. This can be for the good, but it can also be for the worst depending on what that is. Either way, all of a sudden, it's gonna bury itself in your subconscious. I'm Simon from What Culture, and this is 10 wrestling matches that inadvertently became famous. Number 10, Edge vs Alberto Del Rio. Taking place at WrestleMania 27, Edge and Alberto Del Rio clashed in 2011 on the grandest stage for the World Heavyweight title. It was fine, all things considered, and after the Rated R Superstar won, we were like, alright, cool, that was okay. Today, though, it means something else entirely. Due to the injuries that he had built up over the years, mere days after this, doctors told Edge he could never wrestle again if he wanted to stay alive. Terrifying news to say the least, the man listened and walked away from the ring. Aside from being genuinely upsetting, all of a sudden this brawl at Mania had new significance. It was the last time we'd see Edge perform as a wrestler. With that in mind as well, it was also quite nice he was able to do this as champion. It made it all the more poetic. Given what could have happened if his ailments hadn't been caught too, this in many ways was a fitting end for a career that anyone would be proud of. Edge reached the peak and never looked back. Number 9, Stone Cold Steve Austin vs Kane vs The Undertaker vs Mankind. Capital Carnage, a UK event which I was at live, should you care, was a glorified house show. WWE's attempts to take advantage of the growing market and make a load of cash in the process. It was a really fun event though, with an electric crowd. Unfortunately, it's what was happening away from the ring where a tragic story was unfolding. Not only did Jim Ross suffer a relapse of his Bell's palsy, but this was mere hours after he'd learned about the passing of his mother. Being the true pro he is, JR insisted on calling the show, but one would assume the sheer amount of stress was too much for him, as it would be for anyone, and it potentially triggered a return of his illness. Remarkably completing the broadcast, Ross was taken off TV and given time to recover. It's horrible to watch this pay-per-view nowadays knowing this is going on outside. No one deserves to suffer through that, especially not someone like Jim Ross. Number 8, Bret Hart vs Terry Funk. This happened on WCW Thunder. Think of that. That's all I'll say. And if you ever watch Thunder, you'll know why. However, on December 19th, 1999, Bret Hart suffered 2 brutal shots to his head in a match against Goldberg that would ultimately end his career. It's thought that Hart suffered upwards of 3 concussions, and he was left with a crushing post-concussion syndrome diagnosis. However, due to a combination of issues ranging from injury mismanagement to WCW's fundamental misunderstanding of the dangers concussions can cause, Bret continued to wrestle for a month before realizing something was wrong. Knowing this, it's upsetting to watch the legend in any of his follow-up bouts because he's visibly in discomfort. The worst case of neglect, though, came during a Hardcore Rules match with Terry Funk on the January 6th edition of, yes, Thunder. Predictably, Hart took significant punishment in the brawl, including a running chair shot from Funk that connects with Bret's head so hard it's almost impossible to watch. Ruins my life every time I see it. He was also tipped out of a cart full of weapons head first, and to top it all off, the ending was a non-finish. So this was well worth it. Number 7, Jeff Jarrett vs China. No Mercy 1999 was an interesting night, especially because Jeff Jarrett somehow managed to make a good housekeeping match against China pretty good. It also represented one last payday from Vince McMahon that would sever their working relationship forever. Or at least until this year's Hall of Fame. Jarrett's character went nuts in August of 99 as he was cast as a rampant misogynist. The reigning IC champion was abusive towards manager Deborah and other female talent in the organization as a build-up to his eventual dispute with China. The two had battled once at Unforgiven in September, with the 9th wonder of the world proving Jarrett's equal, only to be cheated out of the title by rubbish refereeing. The problem before their rematch, though, was that Jeff's biggest supporter, Vince Russo, had left the Fed to head to WCW. That didn't bode well for the man with the guitar, especially because around this time, his contract almost lapsed. No one realized this, however, so the IC champion revealed he'd be leaving for World Championship Wrestling immediately following the broadcast. Threatening to just jump ship with the belt, Jarrett insisted on a payout ranging from $300,000 to $500,000 and or stock options, depending on which version of the story you want to believe, in order to go out and lose as planned. McMahon felt like he had to do this, and Jarrett did his job with a lot more money in his pocket. Number 6, Booker T versus Buff Bagwell. Buff Bagwell and Booker T were the guinea pigs when it came to seeing what WWE were going to do with WCW, and it soon became apparent this was leading lambs to the slaughter. July 2nd, 2001 was the Raw in question, and even now it's weird. Booker T was the good choice, But Buff Bagwell, the man who at one point was looking at his mum Judy attached to a forklift. In reality, this was dead before it even began too. For years, WWE had told the audience that WCW was evil, so as soon as the fans saw them in the main event, they were ripped to shreds. It clearly affected both men, and the pressure stripped the match away from any potential it may have had. It went from worse to worse before company heels Steve Austin and Kurt Angle ran into a deafening pop. Because of course, it's hard to see what else WWE thought was going to happen. Obviously Booker would survive this to have an awesome career, but Bagwell vanished from all existence. Well, no he didn't, but he was never seen in the WWE again, and to this day still blames Jim Ross. Number 5, Shawn Michaels vs Diesel. On May 19th, 1996 in Madison Square Garden, we had a relatively basic match between Shawn Michaels and Diesel. Well, that would have been the case anyway if what happened after had never occurred. A sold-out Madison Square Garden house show crowd bore witness to kayfabe being chucked out the window after a steel cage WWE title match between these two. It was more personal than usual as Nash was heading to WCW, as was his friend Scott Hall. Fans knew this as well, chanting "You sold out" at them throughout, but this took a whole new turn as the event ended. As HBK was celebrating, Razor Ramon embraced with his longtime rival before Shawn appeared to give the floor Diesel a kiss of life and too sweeted him back to health. They're all joined by Triple H in one big hug as the audience looked on in disbelief. 1996 was a very different time. Though reluctantly approved by Vince McMahon, the curtain call, as it's now known, caused so much rage amongst other wrestlers, it blew up in everybody's face. Only Hunter could get punished given the situation, and he lost his King of the Ring 1996 victory, which interestingly went to Stone Cold Steve Austin instead. Just imagine. Number 4, the 2014 Royal Rumble match. How can a man not entering the Rumble be such a big deal? Well, just go and watch the 2014 Royal Rumble to see how it can break an entire company. Fans were so desperate and so convinced that this was Daniel Bryan's year, they shouted for him from entrant number 1. This is why when we got to entrant number 30 and Rey Mysterio arrived, well, it all just fell apart. Despite usually being a beloved babyface, the master of the 619 got booed out the building like he was Roman Reigns after WrestleMania. It was all anyone wanted to talk about when all was said and done. This got worse too in terms of fan favourites. That aforementioned number 1 spot had gone to CM Punk, probably the only guy that could have calmed the fans in the arena that night. He did put in a solid 49-minute performance, but left the Rumble after Kane pulled him to the floor and chokeslammed him through a table. All that was left was for everyone to boo the hell out of eventual winner Batista. And then Punk walked out of the company 24 hours later. His frustrations had boiled over and he had enough, so he went. We all know what has happened since, and is also kind of responsible for everything that happened at WrestleMania 30 with Bryan. No one saw that at the time, but everything after cemented its place in history. Number 3, the Bella Twins versus Emma. Surely no one could have predicted this. During a time in the WWE where women were most definitely not treated how they should, a match between the Bella Twins and Paige and Emma was given about 30 seconds of Raw TV time in February 2015. Realizing how stupid this was, Twitter users came together to fight a battle to stop this nonsense. The hashtag Give Divas a Chance became a worldwide trend for days as more and more users joined in to point out that women were not being used how they should, or barely even given a chance. This had been made even more obvious because down at NXT they were tearing it up. Surely those on the main roster should be allowed to show what they could actually do. Not even Ric Flair could achieve anything in half a minute. Ironically, it had been Paige and Emma's Choice War at NXT Arrival just under a year earlier that kicked open this door, yet it never transitioned to Raw or SmackDown. Vince McMahon's "We hear you, keep watching" tweet in response blew everything up, and that was it. WWE finally caught up with the times, and that's not a bad fallout for 30 seconds in the ring. Number 2, The Godfather and Val Venus versus Jeff Jarrett and the Blue Blazer. A nothing tag team match buried in the middle of a usual Attitude Era Raw was not a fitting end to Owen Hart's televised life and career as a pro wrestler. He deserved more, but even during this he once again proved he was the best. Didn't matter the situation, Owen could do anything and everything. Given that he was the Blue Blazer here, Owen adjusted his in-ring style accordingly to attack both Val Venus and the Godfather with an array of high-flying and technical assaults. What makes it even sadder is the atmosphere at the time. Fans rarely cared about anything other than the main event in the late 90s, choosing here to chant "We want puppies" simply because Deborah was at ringside. A few even flipped off the camera as it panned around. Obviously no one knew what was going to happen days later, but still, Owen Hart was and is a legend and shouldn't have ever been in this situation to begin with. Only the best would have been appropriate. Number 1, Chris Benoit versus Elijah Burke. Everything that was going on when Chris Benoit took on Elijah Burke during WWE's version of ECW was nuts. Mr. McMahon had been blown up in a limo, and this supposed death was dominating every single brand from moment 1 till the end credits. It even took center stage during a tournament to crown a new ECW champion. And then everything got awful. 6 days after this match, Vince opened an episode of Raw to tell us that Benoit and his family had died. We all know what happened next, but as it would transpire, the tournament semi-final match against Elijah Burke would prove to be Benoit's last ever encounter. Uncharacteristically missing a weekend house show in Texas after murdering Nancy, his wife, on the Friday, and Daniel, his son, on the next day, Benoit was dead himself by the time he was due to be facing CM Punk in the finale. Why anyone would want to watch this today, I don't know, but if you do, it's drowning in sadness, heartache, and controversy.